everybody, one and all. Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan. And for those listeners at home, we're still kind of reeling from some big Friends Talking Fantasy news here.
I feel like reeling has a negative connotation. We're celebrating, Charles.
We are celebrating. I'm just like kind of starstruck, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, so we got a retweet and a comment from the one and only Mark Lawrence, where he let us know that he listened to the podcast that we released. I guess it'll be a couple weeks back.
Well, at the time we're recording right now, the Red Sister episode dropped this morning. Yes. And like it's been maybe an hour or two since Mark Lawrence has replied to our episode announcement on Twitter saying, "A great listen, many thanks." And then not only was that that was enough to send me into like a crazed moment, but he then he shared it on his page. He retweeted it on his Twitter account, which is like unbelievable.
Yeah, starstruck's a good word or a good phrase for it, Charles. I mean, we've loved Mark Lawrence's work since years before we started a podcast. You read the Broken Empire trilogy before I did, and then recommended it to me, and we've just always really appreciated everything Mark Lawrence does out there. So to think that he'd even bother to interact with us on Twitter, and B, that he'd actually listen to us talk about his book is hard to believe for me.
I know. And then to go on to say a great listen and then to retweet it. It's, just like so many things of which we're very grateful. And so we're still coming off the high energy that we just were like texting each other like, dude, did you see this? What's happening to our Twitter right now? So hi Mark Lawrence, if you're listening.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. But, hello. Thanks for listening.
Charles, I could talk about how excited I am about our little interaction with Mark Lawrence for a full episode, but I think we'll try to do the listeners a favor and use that enthusiasm toward chatting about the next book in the Book of the Ancestor, which is Grey Sister by the great Mark Lawrence.
Yes, let's do it. Book of the Ancestor, Book 2. What I would like to talk about before we get too much into the book is that Mark Lawrence started, like at least in my version of the book, he started with like, a thing that's like what you need to know so far or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I don't see too much of in fantasy, but I really enjoyed it. Even though I was going straight from Red Sister to Grey Sister, I still was like, this is a really cool idea that Mark Lawrence put in here. He's like, here's what you need to know, and just to prepare yourself for the plot coming up. And it was only like the story so far, I think is what he called it. And it was just like a few quick plot points, a brief description of the world. And it's something that I wish more fantasy authors would do, honestly, but I really liked it. I appreciated it.
You can tell that Mark Lawrence cares a lot about the reader experience. He's obviously an avid reader of fantasy himself, and he takes a lot of steps to make that experience as easy as it possibly can be. And he did something else similar that I noted back in Red Sister, that he has, I don't know how to pronounce this, dramatis personae. Is that... Do you know how to say that, Charles? Personae? Anyway, the list of characters that you often find in the back of many novels, he put that right up in the front and put a note that said, sometimes you might not notice until you've finished the book if you put it in the back. So he's putting in the front. And I think this story so far thing is all part of Mark Lawrence being what I perceive as very pragmatic about helping readers get the most out of the content he's putting out there. And I appreciate it.
Pragmatic's a good word. A lot of his characters can also be considered very pragmatic as well. So, and what it allows you to do when you get all that stuff out of the way is you can just start the prologue and just full immersive action right away. Some authors do a really good job of reminding us what happened in the narrative of the story at the beginning. It's like, oh, this is so and so who still remembering what she just went through in the last book and is now doing this, as opposed to just being like, look, here's what happened last time, now let's just jump into it. And that's what this book does. I had texted you when we were first, when I first started reading, I'm like, dude, the beginning of this book rips, man. It's right away you are in the front of it. You have House Tassis marching up on all of a sudden the convent is under siege, right, in this flash forward moment.
Yeah.
And then it goes straight to Sister Kettle. Both moments are super interesting, action packed, almost movie-esque. I'm like, this is ripping. This is awesome. It's so nice to just get right into the action, especially for a second book in a trilogy. It's let's not rehash all the details. I gave you those. Let's just jump right into the action, which great.
Yeah, it's cool to see it dive right in where we got what felt like a conclusion to the story being told in Red Sister when that book finished up. And by the way, this will have spoilers for Book of the Ancestor up through Gray Sister. So just a heads up. We did finish Red Sister on a note that's okay, we told the story that needs to be told here, but there were some things left to resolve that were, as you said, Charles, pretty action-packed. And we got to see Apple fighting some folks and saving Kettle, and what she has to deal with on her way to doing that is pretty interesting. You get some different perspectives here that you don't get in Red Sister, which is holding so tight to only Nona's perspective.
Exactly. And I just was, this whole thing with Clara being of course it's her, who else would let me go? It's wow, okay, we're starting this off with a stinger right away, so much fun. And then the whole thing with Apple and Kettle was really touching. You get to see way more of their character in these moments right in the beginning. They were kind of side characters in Red Sister, and now you get to see more behind the scenes of their personal lives and their personal relationship, and it's super fun and almost it's almost kind of fun and campy in kind of a way where she's poison me, I was oh, this is kind of cool. So I just really I was all in on this book right from the first 10 pages.
I'm glad to hear that, Charles. I love Book of the Ancestor. While we were still talking a little bit about the prologue there, I want to say I love how you get in the prologue into Nona's perspective a bit, and she's pissed off, and we know anger is something that is a huge fuel for Nona, and she has all this rage, and it says her friend lay dying, and then in italics it just says her friend. And we have I think this will be out by the time we're releasing the current episode that we're talking about now. We'll have a theme of friendship in Red Sister episode.
Yeah, so let's see there.
If
the
not,
theme of friendship will come out before this. Yeah, so that already happened.
So you'll know that friendship is such an important theme, hence the title, in not just Red Sister, but also Gray Sister and the whole Book of the Ancestor. So you get right back to, all right, Nona might be in the future. She might be this fearsome warrior that everyone's afraid of, but friendship is so important to her. And just those two words in italics, her friend, are so powerful, I felt like.
Sure.
Because you know what that means to Nona.
Absolutely, and we know Ara really well,
Hmm.
and we know Clara really well, and
That
so
we do.
we know what Nona's capable of when she gets mad. So, like, this is a really, like, a lot of times when you have the middle book in a trilogy, sometimes you feel like you have to rehash some of the old stuff and try and just carry you into the final moments. But Lawrence structured it in such a way, he's like, why can't we just get right to the action? Like, everyone knows these characters already. You wouldn't read this before Red Sister. And I just really appreciated the pacing of it, and it really sets up the rest of this book.
Coolio, Charles.
Coolio.
Well, we then jump 2 years into the future. Nona's about 14 now, and she's in Mystic class. And we get acquainted with a little bit of a different cast of characters, some of which are new and some of which are old but maybe didn't take as prominent roles in the previous book. Basically, Nona's closest friends aren't yet in Mystic class. So we've got the people she's closest with are Darla. Darla is the gerent who actually Nona, when she first got into Gray class, had gotten into a bit of a fight with, but
Yeah.
now they've gotten closer. And Zol, who probably at this point Nona would not yet call a friend, but at least someone she's familiar with, who she's come to like a little bit more. And then we get to know Joelle Namsis, who pretty quickly starts filling into that role that we thought Ara was going to fill into in the first
Right.
book of the spoiled brat who is just mean to our protagonist and pretty vindictive. And Joelle, unlike Ara throughout this book, does not ever really reveal herself to have any more, I guess, maybe she has more depth. Not really, though. Like,
No.
I
Like,
feel like she's
from
just a
page
bad
22,
person.
she was very much a bad person,
Yeah.
and she was very much an antagonist for Nona. She was like bullying her, trying to get her in trouble, kept bringing up her dead friend,
Yeah.
like all these like not cool things. And she's right out of the bat. Chapter 2 is just being manipulative for the sake of wanting to put her down. And it does kind of feed more into that dynamic we were talking about that Lawrence subverted in Red Sister, of this like bully character.
Hmm.
And I definitely can see Jolie entering that role for sure in these moments.
Right. We mentioned characters that we couldn't help but think of from other novels that take place in the Magic Academy, like Ambrose from the Kingkiller Chronicle, and we also mentioned Draco Malfoy, and
Mm-hmm.
these characters that feel a little more one-dimensional than Aura ends up being. Joelle ends up being a little more one-dimensional too.
She is
So,
following into that Draco Malfoy role for sure.
well, we end up getting an altercation between Nona and Joelle pretty quick, where Nona, encouraged by Quixote, which is a
Yes.
devil that has taken just, I don't know if taken hold of, probably wouldn't be the right way to phrase it, but gotten into Nona and is kind of a voice in the back of her head, even if he hasn't possessed her or anything like that. And he's encouraging her to say some pretty messed up things and eventually almost choke out Joelle, but Nona is able to hold back. She's prompted to try to choke Joelle because Joelle is saying some messed up things about Hessa, which is Nona's belated friend. What were your thoughts on this interaction?
What stuck out to me in that moment was our introduction to Quixote.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, we don't, at the moment he's introduced, I'm just gonna say he, but I don't really know. I think it's a him. But Quixote is like, just Mark Lawrence writes Quixote into the story like he was there the whole time. We just kind of jump into it, and Quixote is like across the skin of her back. Quixote trembled with laughter. It's kind of, and we're just like, who's Quixote now, and why is he like across her back? Like this whole idea of demons and how they work and stuff we didn't really get into at this point. But what that allows us to do is realize that there's something kind of maniacal going on with Nona, and I just thought it was a really interesting way to introduce Quixote into the fray here. In the before, in that beginning thing before the prologue, he does mention there's a character called Quixote and you're not supposed to know who he is. So I was like, okay, this character, we're not supposed to know who they are. And I just kind of went with it. And I thought it was a great introduction, and it kind of builds off of what was only said in these ominous passing phrases from Ramsel Taxis in the end of Red Sister, Raymol at the end of Red Sister. So that was what stuck out to me in that scene the most. And I really thought that using Jolie as kind of the thing that triggers these vengeful, angry, violent thoughts from Nona, which then wakes up Quixote, was a really interesting dynamic.
I felt the same way, Charles. Following Red Sister, it's very natural to be curious about these demons, given that Raymol was full of them and he was saying they won't let me die. And it's like, what is going on with these demons? And Mark Lawrence gives us some more information through Quixote and gives us an idea of what the experience of having just one of these demons inside you could be like. Obviously, Raymol had more. And Quixote is such an interesting character added to this. I think he makes the experience of being in Nona's perspective so much more fun because he basically gets to be almost literally sometimes the devil on the shoulder, maybe the devil in the shoulder. But he ends up being almost emblematic in some ways of this side of Nona that she's fighting with, which is that she does have a desire to hurt or kill when it comes to her enemies and take some pleasure in that. That's how Quixote was able to get into Nona in the first place. So Quixote ends up being a voice for a lot of those inner desires.
Yeah, well said. It's definitely kind of shining some light on this part of Nona that at the end of the book, which we'll get to, is reintroduced to this idea of her violent tendencies and how that kind of shapes her character. But when she has Quixote on her back or on her shoulder, like you said, she kind of enjoys having those conversations, and Quixote's kind of getting that fuel. And then we'll talk about later on when he's gone and how Nona is like, how much of that was the devil encouraging me, and how much is it like, oh, now I take full responsibility for all these things that I do. And so that's being introduced here, and it is a great way to kind of amplify her violent tendencies, because like, oh, you should kill them, and she's like, no, I don't want to do that. And it's like, it's kind of a fun thing to do. And then it's interesting to see what happens when he's gone. So very interesting.
Very true, Charles. I know you drew some parallels between this and the Poppy War, actually.
Yeah.
And I won't spoil anything from the Poppy War, but for those who have read both the Poppy War and Book of the Ancestor, then it's easy to see how there might be a parallel for Quixote going on in the Poppy War.
For sure.
I was
There's a very
about.
interesting discussion to be had comparing Nona to
Rin.
And it's the same way. It's almost this theme of accepting responsibility and how violent is the individual, no matter how do you justify your violence, kind of. So Nona's kind of working with that. At this point, she hasn't, the story's just starting, but we'll see how Nona, it touches on a little bit. I think it's going to have way more consequence in the third book, but she's starting to grapple with this idea of her her violence and like how much of it she feels shame of, how much of it she needs as fuel for fighting and stuff like that. So it's a very interesting part of Nona's character that kind of gets challenged and tempted here with the devil Quixote. So yeah,
Yeah.
super interesting.
There's even times where she longs for Quixote after he's gone, where she's like, "Oh, I wish his voice was encouraging me right now." So
Yeah,
we'll get into that a little bit more, but
Yeah. I was
yeah,
like, that's a little troubling.
that it is. All right, well, we got a little distracted by the how fun it is to talk about Quixote there, but if we head back to where we were in the story, it'll be that Nona gets in trouble for her laying her hand on Joelle, where Joelle plays it up like Nona tried to kill her, basically. Nona
Yeah,
gets taken to the convent table. Turns out that Joelle had
she
used
shows up with
some.
like the brace on, like
Mhm,
some kind
yep.
of fraud at a courtroom
Mhm.
who plays up their injuries by coming in with all the neck brace and casts and everything. Very
Exactly.
much what's happening here.
Yeah, she's gotten some bruising by creating a concoction.
Oh
And
yeah, that's right. That's
yeah,
right.
so she's got bruising around her throat that's not actually real.
Yeah.
So, in the end, Zol ends up defending Nona, and Zol actually lies to get Nona out of it. Not lies in the sense that what Zol said isn't true, but lies in the sense that
She didn't actually
she
because
didn't
she said
witness
I
it.
saw her,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
they were cool. But she's like, I didn't actually see, but I'm assuming, I just know that you were right. So
Yep.
ends to find the means here, which is what a lot of the nuns kind of teach that a lot
Well,
in
Abbess
their own way.
Glass, especially.
Right. And that's another interesting thing about these moments. We're getting a lot of POVs with Abbess Glass. And I think it's through her perspective that we see this trial play out. And it's interesting to see how Glass, like, never really believes Jolie, but is still working in the system of the convent and hearing all the different sides, holding court essentially, but kind of always being on Team Nona, which is an interesting one. It just kind of builds up Jolie's character of being manipulative and dishonest and things like that. But it was the beginnings to see the cracks in Zol's character that are the most interesting here. We're starting to see that she's willing to, bend a little bit to help out Nona, which was a charming thing to see.
For sure. And I think that's something that Lawrence does extremely well throughout the trilogy is that our first glance at most characters, they're often a product of their upbringing or wherever they've come from or how they've been taught. But as they get more time in the convent, usually then they get to come out of their shell or at least round out their character in a way where we find out, oh, okay, maybe they actually aren't so bad. And I think we get a lot of understanding about Nona through that fact, where Nona's first reaction, because she's had such a rough upbringing and doesn't really trust people off the bat, is, oh, this person must be mean, this person must be bad. And then slowly but surely we find out, well, not everyone actually is. In fact, most of them aren't. But Joelle totally is. But Zol maybe isn't so bad. And we start to see that a little bit at the end of Red Sister, despite the fact that when she first comes, she seems like she's a bad guy.
Right, especially with Zol's character. Mark Lawrence does a great job of slowly introducing the cracks into her like forward-facing persona. I think it's a really like honest way of portraying Zol's character. How over the course of the book, she slowly starts to show these elements of how friendship is affecting her from when she first came to the school to by the end of this book, what ends up happening with her. So, and he's just slowly, patiently weaving in. This is the first one where it's like, well, I lied, but not really. And that's because, you need to face the truth. And then she's also like, I see that, you're not hiding that demon really well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not going to tell anybody, but, you might want to keep that in check because someone will find out soon, you know? So and then Nona was like, wow, that's the most words she's ever said at once to me, maybe more than she's ever said combined to this point. So it's moments like that that like really build the characterization of a character who supposedly has no character, right? We start to kind of like the relationship dynamic of, and that all kind of starts to form in these moments following the, I guess it's a trial or not really, but following that hearing, were really fun.
Definitely. I like all those moments. I like how Zol starts throwing around, oh yeah, the chosen one is supposed to stand by her shield, and it's like, it's kind of, I don't know, it's cute, especially
It's
when
a
you
bit endearing
remember
too,
that
yeah.
they're teenagers at this time, and they're just trying to navigate that awkward time as they
Mhm.
move through the equivalent of a school, and
Right.
we can
And
all
Zoe was
relate
very
to
much
that.
an isolated
Hmm.
individual, top of her class, didn't really say anything, um, very determined. And now she's starting to show that she's capable of like talking to people, maybe even cracking a joke, maybe. So it's like, these moments are kind of endearing. And it's these relationships that Nona has with all these different characters is what really makes this whole trilogy shine for me up to this point.
Totally agree with you there, Charles. It's interesting that Zol starts to emerge a little bit and show some of these nicer sides when she's away from Yisht. And there's even a moment later where Yisht says something like, friends are weakness. I taught that to Zol or whatever. And I was getting the sense, okay, maybe a lot of reason why Zol was the way she was to start with was that she was raised by Yisht in a lot of ways and influenced by Sherzel as well. So, all right, yeah, that's fun stuff with the Zol Nona interactions. We
Mhm.
end up getting, I think, some more fun stuff where Nona and the crew are visiting the caves,
Yeah.
and then they get chased out by the Holothor, which is an interesting part of this book, this whole Holothor thing, Charles,
Right.
where Quixote's afraid of this thing. It's hard to really understand what it actually is, but just something in the caves that scares everyone a ton. Everyone ends up running and then they can't remember what it was from. Only Nona can, and that's because Quixote protected her in some way.
Right. What Mark Lawrence does in this trilogy that I really love, when we're talking about world building, like you read something like Tolkien, and Tolkien describes the whole history of everything and the whole the way everything looks and whatever and the whole history. But then you have someone like Mark Lawrence who's exceptionally good at kind of keeping the mystery and the intrigue alive, and everything is kind of introduced as a puzzle. Something that's like, okay, there's this Holothor thing, may or may not be part of this original group that came from the spaceship and set up this
Hmm.
glass, right? It's this moon, which is a piece of technology. So it's like all these are more pieces. And then we learn more about thread work and more about the demon, Quixote, and what he's capable of. And then Quixote kind of knows what a Holothor is. Mark Lawrence never actually explains any of this in any kind of detail, but he leaves the pieces on the table. And it's kind of like the piece that the flash forwards serve. Like we know the convent gets besieged by the Taxis family. So it's like these really interesting pieces, and it keeps the drama going and it keeps the suspense going. And it's such a masterful way he chooses to unveil information, and it's almost like from the perspective of the characters, like as much as the characters do that
Hmm.
this creature exists, and like, oh, that moon is in the sky, but then it's like how it got there, and then all these pieces that you're of magic you're getting introduced to that have a relationship with it somehow, and it's slowly starting to come together. But this is a moment where more of these, like the plot thickens kind of with the setting of this world. It's like, hey, there might be more going on with how this setting came to be than we know of. And this Holothor is a moment that we're kind of introduced to that of like, what is this thing and how did it get here? So,
Well said, Charles. Often the questions are and mysteries are more interesting than answers ever would be, and I think Mark Lawrence is well aware of those things and gives us no more than would be really interesting with the Holothor because I've read this book twice now, and I'm still like, what is going on with that Holothor? And the fact that after reading multiple times, I'm still curious about that is such a compliment to Lawrence's writing
Yeah, if
around it
Tolkien
because,
wrote this book, he'd be like, and then the Holothor went back into the cave and
yep,
lived the rest of his days, and and you're like, oh, cool, I know exactly what that is now.
that's so well said, Charles. And I hate to say it, but that's part of the reason why with the Lord of the Rings I don't often end up getting that as intrigued because it is all out there, and once I have the answers, I'm kind of like, okay, well, I'm satiated, I'm moving on.
Yeah, well,
So,
Lawrence is definitely trying to go for more mystery, more suspense, more
mhm,
drama. Where like Lord of the Rings is kind of like a epic tale. So, two different techniques, and Mark Lawrence expertly shows how to unveil kind of pieces of his puzzle, and the fact that his settings are so unique and wild, and the blend of sci-fi with fantasy, where it's like the characters perceive it as something maybe more magical or more religion
yeah,
based when it's such a hard science thing. So it's like how much of this is science versus magic, so it's like all these pieces are coming down, and like you said, you use the Holothor, man. It's like who knows what's going on.
yeah. And I love Quixote's reaction to all of these things, where Quixote kind of seems to realize that he doesn't know everything there is to know about these things, but seems a little bit insecure about that, and then
Yeah.
like condescends to Nona when he really doesn't have the answers either.
Yeah.
It's I just love their exchanges where that's happening. Like Quixote, when you think of someone writing a demon that's sort of possessing someone, you don't really think about that demon kind of having a like interesting and nuanced personality.
Yeah.
Where obviously Quixote still just wants violence and death and things like that, but it does feel interesting that Quixote like has its own insecurities.
Yeah, and but Mark Lawrence keeps it very
It's
understated, which I
yeah.
appreciate. It's not like a satire book where it's like over the top.
Hmm.
It's just enough to give it that bit of a more fleshed out characterization. He's still a demon. He's still like
Yep.
always trying to get her to kill people, but it's just kind of funny you get these moments where it's afraid or it's, being passive aggressive or insecure, but it's always subtle, which I like a lot.
For sure. Things like when she ends up in the cold water a bunch of times when she's practicing for the the Gray Sister trial thing,
Yeah.
and then it's like Kyo was upset by that, like just getting cold constantly, maybe. And
Yeah.
then it's like, yeah, Kyo was pretty quiet for a while after that. And
And then
just
the
went
moments where
out.
he goes to the bath and it's like you just want to look at all the all the
Yeah,
women bathing. He's like he doesn't like admit that. He's just like I just like the warmth. I don't know what you're talking about. So
yeah. Quixote is like, your bodies are not interesting to me. Like I'm this ancient figure. And it's like
so it's
you're
interesting, like
primitive.
the Quixote origins. It's like was this a person at one point who through sci-fi stuff became this demon thing, or who knows? Like and it's the mystery around it that keeps it kind of fun and interesting.
Well, we do hear from Zol at this point that
Hmm.
a little bit more about the demons. They have a different name for them that I didn't write down and don't remember. But it, she does say that they were left behind in some way by the missing. And
Right.
we know that the Ice Tribers, they hold a lot of secrets. They seem to know a lot more about the ancient stuff that's played out in this world than do the, I guess, seemingly more civilized, quote unquote, folks in the corridor.
Yes. It comes back to that piece of like the mystery that is the setting of Mark Lawrence, and we've been tossing around this idea of making an episode dedicated to how Mark Lawrence uses his settings to tell stories, because it's one of the most unique
Nice tease.
ways I've seen settings used in fantasy. So we'll dedicate a conversation to that, but this is all part of it. It's like, okay, are they part of this greater sci sci-fi origin to this setting. Like, I'm not, and the fact that no one in this modern age with the Nona age knows what it is.
The Nona
It
age.
is what makes it super interesting. Yeah, the Nona age.
It's well said, Charles. It all comes down to what I think is Lawrence uses perspective so well. The same way I was talking about with the characters, where we're tight to Nona's perspective for most of this. So we kind of see people through this Nona lens of, I don't trust them, they seem bad, oh, maybe they're not so bad. And the setting is like that too, where we see things through Nona and the other characters' perspectives, where they feel like they're more in a fantasy novel than a sci-fi novel too, and we're reading a fantasy novel, so we're right there with them. But all these sci-fi elements are then interpreted through that more, like you mentioned, Charles, magical lens, or through a more like ancient way of thinking about it than through a sci-fi bit.
Very
So
well said. It's that perspective that is really what makes Mark Lawrence's writing stand out in a lot of ways. And then this book also shines with the characterizations and the dynamics between characters across time, and the way we go back and forth in time and through perspectives. It's like a wild ride.
Yeah, and the one thing that I do miss with the relationships and stuff is more Clara.
Yeah.
That's one thing. As you're reading the middle, well, pretty much all but the end of the book, it's like, it would be nice if we could. I understand why she's not here, but it'd be nice if we could see a little more Clara action. But we'll get there, Charles, when Clara gets back later in this book. So
that's right. She comes in. She comes in way later, and only for a brief, flashing moment.
But what a wonderful moment it is.
Mm.
So eventually, we get this moment where they visit the Menzies family, and this feels a little different from most of what we get. And Nona gets to have a sort of dinner with nobles. Regal is also there for whatever reason. I guess he's gotten famous as being a ring fighter. Right. Regal seems to pop up wherever we most need him, and he pops up here. It's kind of a fun little exchange that we get. And we also get Saphira, who feels kind of like the Clara of the past, like generations class.
Yeah.
Right? If Kettle's kind of Nona, this is her friend, and actually more than that. I think Saphira and Kettle have a romantic history where Nona and Clara do not, at least to this point, and that's not me saying they will. That's me just.
But Clara does seem to have a crush on Nona.
She does.
I would suspect.
Yes, there's many moments in Red Sister that indicate that, but it does not seem to be requited by Nona. But either way, right? Saphira is this figure that was part of the class, and then for one reason or another, she ends up not anymore, and more on this Taxis, Chazal side of things. So it's interesting noting the parallels, and we get some interaction between Saphira and Kettle here. That doesn't amount to much yet, I feel like, unless you've got stuff you want to talk about there.
No, I will just say the Nona Regal stuff that comes up is those moments that kind of remind us that Nona is a teenager still in a lot of ways, because she does kind of get a little awkward around him and she doesn't quite know why. We know through Abbas Glass' perspective, she's like, oh, these two are just kind of are kind of crushing on each other a little bit. Yep. But from Nona's perspective, she doesn't know, and it's these few moments that we get that still remind us of, like, she's still just like a girl going out from boarding school out onto the town and meeting people and stuff. So it was a fun little character balance there, and just a fun moment.
It's always interesting when these characters who are total badasses when they fight end up reminding you that they're teenagers and they're a little
not
bumbling.
Social skills.
Yeah. So that's a fun moment for sure. Yeah. And it is, I'll say Abbas Glass gets a lot of the best just lines in this book. Like her perspective is very interesting how she sees through everyone. So she almost gives us a little bit more of what Mark Lawrence sees the characters as, where he's so subtle
Mm-hmm.
when he's in the perspectives of Nona or even Kettle. But when we're in the perspective of Abbess Glass, because she understands people so well, we get to hear, I think, a little bit more directly, like, here's what's going on behind the scenes, and let me just say it.
Right. Abbas Glass is definitely one of those pragmatic Mark Lawrence characters
Yep.
who identifies cause and effect and has a plan and is more understanding just of the logistical progression of characters and decisions they make. Very pragmatic view of the world. And those kinds of characters really shine with Mark Lawrence's voice. So it's always fun when a Abbas Glass chapter comes up.
Well said, Charles. All right, we end up having Nona do this trial. Basically, if she doesn't pass, then she can't be a Grey Sister. She doesn't have a shadow, and she's pretty recognizable with her fully black eyes. So,
Right.
and they also move the location, so it's in the convent. So it's pretty much all these things are conspiring to make things worse for Nona's chances of actually being able to win this trial, which requires her to be unseen as she climbs a tree and retrieves a box. And she ends up coming up with this plan to send out a bunch of imposter Nonas, which are basically her friends dressed up
Yeah,
in
it's
ways.
kind of the reverse of the expectations. Like instead of you disguising yourself, you disguise everyone else as you.
Yeah.
That was the flip that Nona did to win the trial, which was an interesting. It was interesting to like hear this being described and trying to picture it in your mind. Like this is kind of wild. This is kind of a crazy thing that's happening right now. It's a lot of. It sounds very chaotic.
Yeah. I do love the idea of Joelle and her friends like uncovering people. It's like, oh, it's Jula. And she like didn't even know Jula's name, I think, too.
Yeah.
So
And
good.
this was a really good example of keeping us in Nona's perspective as she's preparing for the trial, but you still don't know what to expect, right? Mark Lawrence skates this fine line of like you committing to writing tightly from Nona's perspective without giving away what her plans actually are. So you see she's like smearing stuff on the tree roots and she's practicing how to jump really far and she's doing all these things and you're kind of like I wonder what she's planning without actually spoiling it or without actually waiting until after it happens to tell us like, oh, this is actually what happened this whole time. She was preparing these whole things. And you're like, come on, man. No, I think he played it really well in terms of what information to give us to keep it going and make it feel earned in the moment as well. Very impressive, very fine line he kind of walks to keep that moment kind of honest and earned.
Sounds like you liked this twist a lot better than you liked
I
the
wouldn't call it a
Clara
twist,
reveal.
but
This plot point better than you liked the Clara reveal. And
yeah, because it's a challenge when you're so close to the perspective of the main character to try and have these twists that the character was preparing for the whole time. And I think this is one of the prime examples of Mark Lawrence keeping that perspective close without portraying any of the fun moments that make it feel earned as from the reading experience. This is a great
yeah,
example of that. Tough thing
true.
to do.
Another line that Lawrence walks really well here, I think, is he has these moments that feel, I think you used the word campy before, Charles, and
Yeah.
almost like a little like zany and fun shenanigan-y,
Yeah.
while I don't know, he's able to find that tone that reminds you that they're kids. Like at one point, I think Jula is like wielding a frying pan when they're going down to potentially encounter the Holothor,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you get those kind of moments while also being able to find that more dark, gritty fantasy tone that we got used to from Lawrence when we were reading the Broken Empire trilogy.
Exactly. I was going to compare it to Broken Empire too, because this is all part of the school setting, right? Mark Lawrence kind of holds on to that setting as much as he can by also reminding us that there's still kids in school, and kids in school do still kind of have silly thoughts and ideas, like putting Yish in a barrel,
Yes.
amongst other things. So yeah, it's just, and that's the difference between this and Broken Empire, is that, you know, he's still trying to weave in these dynamic characterization moments of, like, as horrific and violent, as intense and as high stakes as this gets, there's still this piece of there's still teenagers in school. That's the difference.
True, and the juxtaposition, I think, makes the dark, gritty moments even more powerful.
Absolutely. And it makes when the relationship dynamics change between the characters, it makes it that much more gripping and engaging and things like that.
Yes, it does, Charles. Well, I forgot to mention that the Inquisition came to town. So
They
that
sure
means
did.
that Brother Pelter, who basically just seems like a jerk, is
I read that
there,
in
and
your notes. I was like, okay, that's kind of funny.
Brother Pelter is a jerk is
Yeah. That's in
my
our
notes,
episode
yes.
notes. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know, he's another one of those characters where it almost is surprising to me at this point when Mark Lawrence has a character that feels more one-dimensional, because we get so much depth from characters like Aura and Clara and of course Nona, that I keep almost expecting the reveal with some of these other characters that we don't ever end up getting as much. So I think Brother Pelter, not just a jerk, I'm just like, or is just a jerk, and I'm like, okay, well, there's that. And he ends up sending his watchers around, and he keeps bugging Abyss Glass about how there's heresy going on, as Abyss Glass is quick to note that hearsay and heresy, though they may sound similar, are very different things. It does feel
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
most of what
Got him.
is, yeah. Abyss Glass has great lines in here.
Yeah.
So she drops that one on him, and they go back and forth for a while, and eventually, when Nona and the crew went back to the caves and Nona retrieves her shadow, which is kind of interesting, they end up finding out that this happened because she trips some path tripwire via Joelle.
Mhm.
And Joelle tells Brother Pelter, and it becomes this scene where it's like, all right, this time Nona's not going to be able to get out of it, and she's sentenced to death by
Sure.
Brother Pelter.
And it's
the
interesting also in this
crew.
moment to note that Jolie, like, she is a master thread worker, literally, but also, like, up to this point, figuratively, she kept goading Nona by continuing to
Yep.
mention, oh, Henna's dead, like, and you still haven't been down there. Like, what a
Hessa.
friend, Hessa, sorry, yeah, what a good friend you are, not going down there. And like, she kept antagonizing Nona, and Nona took the bait, right? She may not be so susceptible to having her threads pulled, but she's certainly susceptible to her friendships, and Jolie is kind of pulling the threads, not just through actual thread work, but by
Right.
using this theme of friendship to get her to do what Jolie wants her to do, which is go down into the caves and incriminate herself.
And in some ways, we do get a fresh perspective, at least from what I've read, via Joelle here, because it feels like these characters that do things like thread work in here, or we think of Breeze from Mistborn, who does the emotional allomancy, which is somewhat
Right.
similar. It's like they almost always seem to be like good people that it's like we get to hear from them, like, oh, maybe it's actually not so bad to pull people's threads. And with Joelle, it's like, well, if it's in someone's hands who's a total jerk. Two total jerk characters here. And one of them can pull people's threads both figuratively and literally, and it's like, oh,
Mhm.
yeah, this is pretty messed up what she's doing. And
Yes,
we get to
and it
see a little
reminds
more
us
of
of
that
Nona's
later.
weaknesses, not just by being overpowered in the ways of the path and whatever, but her her ability to be kind of triggered or manipulated through friendships. Like in the first book, Red Sister, it's friendships like, oh, you know, you can't really be really, you have to wear be careful who you trust, and anything bad someone does, they'll do to you, and like all this other stuff. And
Hmm.
we see that being used against Nona here of like, oh, I know she loves her friends so much, I could get her to do something illegal and in trouble,
Right.
and it was pretty easy. And Nona realized she fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Like when she actually paused to think about it, she was like, man, I really fell for that hard. What was I thinking? So just kind of a look into Nona's character and kind of one of the many warning signs we get of her. Um, but just an interesting way of it being used against her, not because like Hessa betrayed her, but other characters who want to incriminate her using that knowledge of how much she loved Hessa to get her to do something incriminating. So very interesting.
That it is, Charles. Well, Abbott's Glass and Kettle aren't going to stand for Nona being put to death here, so they end up, mostly Kettle actually doing the actions here, helping Nona escape.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, Kettle and Nona form a thread bond, which ends up being a thing that Mark Lawrence will use to let us get into Kettle's perspective a lot more
Yeah.
without making it feel like we've abandoned Nona's perspective. It's an interesting device there.
Yes.
So we also get a moment here where Nona is regretting not listening to Quixote. Quixote says in her head, "You should have murdered her that first day," referring to Joelle.
Yeah.
And we get from Nona, "Yes." Nona wiped her eyes and set her mouth in a grim line. "I probably should have." So we see Nona, obviously not just this force for good that's always disputing Quixote. She definitely has some of those inclinations herself and ends up being like, should have listened to the demon.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how Nona's kind of at a low point here, and she, and to see her relationship with Sister Kettle kind of develop, and we get to see more from Kettle's perspective starting from here. It's all super interesting. That teacher student dynamic starts to dissolve a little bit, and they actually are becoming friends and crossing into this realm of trusting each other with information, and like kind of breaking the rules together, and Sister Kettle letting stuff slide that a sister probably wouldn't normally let a student get away with. And it's all starting here. So even though Nona's leaving the convent as a wanted criminal who was sentenced to death, it's still kind of um, developing these relationships and getting Nona outside the school.
True. And probably worth mentioning that Kettle is also a little bit on the out with the church these days
They're like
because when
discovering that
Apple
she's shadow bound or whatever.
when
And
Apple saved her, that kind of was a defiance of the ancestor. So yeah, rough one for Kettle. I guess better than dying probably, but she
I get that sense.
also not as much on the inner circle these days when it comes to the church, especially with all those inquisitors around. So then Kettle. Forgot to mention, Zoll also ran away at some point there.
After that moment, yeah, because there's
Yeah.
a while where Glass is still at the convent and Kettle and Nona are gone, and the
Hmm.
Inquisition is getting Abbess Glass more and more in trouble and working up towards arresting her. And by the time they do arrest her, it's because Zoll had escaped,
Yeah.
and from Glass's perspective, we just know that a report came that Zoll left. And it's
Hmm.
like, and we kind of know that that's seemingly part of her calculations to kind of let her go. And it's what ultimately gets her arrested by the Inquisition, amongst other things.
True. And it is nice to be in Abbess Glass's perspective after Nona leaves and Abbess Glass is kind of watching Zoll and she's like, when is she going to leave here?
Yeah, right.
So we get more insight into Abbess Glass's plans and that she does know these things are going to happen well before they do. She's not always 100% right. She might think that Zola is going to leave a little earlier, but she knows enough.
Yeah,
And
she's like she's supposed to leave. I'm surprised she's holding out this long, kind of a thing.
yeah,
And yeah, it's an endearing way to develop Zol's character without ever having to see or hear from her. It's like the physical act of her like still sticking around and then eventually leaving speaks to her character just as much as if Glass had a sit down conversation with her. It's a fun little moment of characterization there.
and we do get moments where even Abbas Glass is surprised by Zol.
Yes.
Zol asks her for advice at one point, and it's in front of, I think, Brother Pelter, and she's like, she tries to conceal that she's surprised by it, and just kind of is like, you should stay here. It's like,
Yeah.
I think that's when
She does
Truzal is
drop a
trying to get her
clue in there
back.
somewhere in her reply. I'm trying to remember what it was exactly that she said at that moment, but
Well, it makes sense if she was like, the chosen one should be with the shield.
yeah,
That would be a good hint, but I don't remember. So
there
tough
was
one
there
for us.
was like a phrase in there that was kind of a clue for Zoe
Mm.
about her true intentions. I kind of remember that. I just didn't bookmark it.
Well, we'll end up get into this sequence now, Charles, where Nona's on the road. We get some interesting interactions there. This feels like something that there's not a ton to cover here compared to the end, where Giljon tries to capture Nona when Nona returns to what's left of her home village, and he fails. Nona ends up putting him in his own cage, I think, at one point, and then she lets him go. Quixote's not pumped about that. Then she meets this priest. He tells her that her mom is dead, and then Nona gets captured by the Noiguin. It's pretty much what goes down there.
Yeah, we get a little bit like kind of like a return to home thing. It's interesting that every single character, both on her team and against her, knew that's exactly what she was going to do. It's like, well, obviously she's got nowhere else to go. She might try and revisit her home, and that kind of sets a lot of stuff against her in those moments. And she gets to see that her, hometown is just gone and that her mother's likely dead, and some of these things still remain a mystery to her, and so we get those few moments which are interesting, but more importantly we kind of we get the ball rolling here as to getting like reunited with Kettle and Zol, which is a fun little trio.
It is fun, and don't forget Clara, Charles.
Well, that's later on, right? It's not until they're
Well,
in
I
the
think
Tetragode.
so. I think that Kettle and Zol are together without Nona, and then Zol leaves, and then Kettle and Nona and Clara are all together without Zol
Oh,
until
yes,
the
yes,
very end.
yes.
So the real trio, Charles, is Kettle, Nona, and Clara. But anyway, we'll get there. Right now, we're more in this place where Nona's captured, and Kettle and Zol end up meeting up, and Kettle's like, "What are you doing here, Zol?" Zol ends up like pretty brutally killing a Noiguin. I think the Noiguin are they're like the stormtroopers of this, and that'll become even more relevant later. But they're the stormtroopers in the sense that they we keep hearing how amazing they are at fighting, but like all the characters we know keep killing them. Like, so I don't know.
Well, they have to be
That's
of
a
a
part.
sufficient size.
Yeah, an army of sufficient size. But it feels like every time the Noig, in case Mark Lawrence is listening, I won't go in too deep. And Mark, I love this book overall, but it does feel like it's a little more tell than show when it comes to the Noiguin being great fighters.
Right. I get that sense, but they make the distinction between Lightless and Noi Gun, and the only people that actually manage to kill one are Zol, who is the chosen one, right? And who is an anomaly, and Nona as well, who also has like 3 different kinds of blood. So it's 2 exceptional characters. They
That's
just
fair.
happen to be killing a lot of them. Like Kettle herself is like no way, this is crazy. But it's only because it's Kettle and Zolan. You can make the argument they were close to the ship heart and like all these other things. But yeah, they still managed to achieve a lot given how built up the Noi gun have been to this point.
Yeah, well, also they broke in and tried to like kill Nona back in Red Sister, and like
Yeah.
missed, like threw a knife at Nona, and like, and I guess I don't know. I'm just like, when are they gonna kill someone that we care about or something like that, where we'll be like, oh, we should take them seriously. The lightless thing is probably a good point there, Charles, the distinction. So maybe the lightless are a little bit more the stormtroopers, but
Yeah, they definitely take out a lot of lightless, which are different from certified Noi gun, which I think there's only two that they managed to kill that whole time. They still managed to hang out in their little headquarters the whole time undetected, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, I guess there were really only two, and it does speak to kind of the power of Zol and Nona, but we don't really get
yeah.
to see the Noi gun do anything that earns their reputation just because we're stuck so close to Zol and Nona, who are in themselves exceptional.
That's well said, Charles. That we get reactions like Kettle being like, oh, "You just killed a Noiguin," but that's about the extent of it. Part of the stormtrooper bit here for me is that we get these moments where Zol basically tries to use the Force. She's it's like very reminiscent of these are not the droids you're looking for, where I I didn't write down any of the actual lines she delivers, but she just like says a statement like, you know her, and then they're like,
Yes.
I know her. Like, so I thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, she does kind of show off more of her abilities and the potential that someone with all four, bloodlines in her is capable of doing. And Zol's kind of opening herself up a little bit more to Kettle, and so it's like all these kinds of fun things here are happening.
Right. Meanwhile, so we probably mentioned this already. The Abbess is being taken to Sherzal to be tried for heresy. She runs into Regal at one point.
Yeah,
Regal's just all over the place. He's
he
wherever.
gets around. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, other than that, Nona now is being imprisoned, and she ends up with Thurin Taxis there, and he uses something called the Harm on her, which is
Yes.
an interesting device there, Charles.
Yes, it's a medallion that causes the worst possible pain imaginable, and then when it's removed, it's like nothing happened. But it leaves Nona like scarred for life. So it's like this really intense, just horrible thing that we get introduced to that the Taxis have.
Right. So if it's strapped on you, then you're basically undergoing the most possible pain you ever could. And it doesn't leave a mark or anything like that. And we get the sense that these taxi, whatever the plural of taxis is, we get that they are pretty malicious. They tend to enjoy actually hurting people. So Thurin is like, I'll use this on you just so you get a sense, but I want to hurt you in a way that you can actually see. So he doesn't end up leaving it on her for particularly long. And
Right. Because
yeah,
he's like, it doesn't leave although it's the worst pain possible, it doesn't leave any marks. It's like it never happened, and I want to do something that really stretches this out and leaves marks. And there's this other element besides pure pain that I want to inflict on you. It's like really kind of a gruesome moment there of what he's trying to do. He like wants to take her apart piece by piece, and he's like, just causing you the worst pain imaginable is not the only thing I'm trying to do here. I want to like destroy you. So this very threatening moment here, and it kind of sets the stakes for like Nona really, she better escape before he comes back.
she better
be there. Yeah.
And she keeps trying to. And I do like how Lawrence has it where there are these ways Nona potentially could escape, and basically each one the the Noiguin had already planned for, so it's like just not working. And she
Right. The Noi gun kind of set traps. It's like, okay, once she breaks through that, we'll know instantly and
mm,
react. It's part of the psychological torture of the prison, the cage that she's in, is to give her these opportunities.
right. So she ends up killing a bunch of, it would be lightless then, and
Yeah.
she does end up killing a Noiguin, but she gets poisoned is I guess the important thing to take out of this, which then ends up with Kettle coming into Nona's body via the thread bond and helping Nona end up taking the right antidote. And we also have Kettle realizing that Nona has Quixote in her. Then we
Which
end
is
up.
interesting how she reacts, right? She leaves a message for Nona by telling
Oh, yes.
Kyo. So there's this unspoken thing of like, I know you have a demon in you, and if we still had this teacher student relationship, you would be like expelled. But much higher stakes right now. Here's a message of like how to survive or whatever, you know. So it's kind of a fun little dynamic piece there. That was a
Well
ingenuitive
said.
way of using the demons.
Yeah. It's it's interesting watching Quixote during this whole time too, where Quixote's motivations are they basically are always about his own self, like being able to survive and if he either stays in Nona and survives or potentially moves into someone else and survives. So at one point, he seems like he's pretty excited about the idea that he might get to go into Taxis because he's like, yeah, there's
Yes.
a guy who that's a guy of my own, like, oh God, what do they say? It's like a kindred spirit that
Yes.
he sees in Taxis. And then other times he's like, oh, I like you need to stay alive because if you just die alone in here, then I'm not gonna be able to go anywhere. So, yeah, following some interesting Quixote stuff here. But eventually, Nona is able to escape, but she's only able to escape because of the return of Clara, Charles.
The return of Clara. That was a fun moment. We see through like the flash forwards and everything that there's definitely this falling out but still holding on, and it's interesting to see like knowing where things end up in the future, like what kind of stage of progression their relationship is at in this moment, and we still see Clara trying to have the best of both worlds
Mm-hmm.
kind of, and hasn't fully committed to one side, and it's that kind of line that she's balancing, and we're like, oh man, Clara has more opportunities here. We'll see if she how she reacts to being like, you could come back now from all the work you've done, and things like that. So yeah, always happy to see Clara back in the fold. It keeps things interesting.
I Claire is my favorite, Charles. I just love the way Claire is used in this one too, where eventually we'll get to the fight with Yisht, but there's like it's very clear that Clara was not involved in in that, and there's even a mention where during that Nona's like, "Oh, I haven't seen Clara for a while," and a reader familiar with tropes might think, "Oh, like Clara's gonna come back and help, and that's how they're gonna get out of this." And it's like,
Right.
no, Clara actually is just not trying to fight Yisht.
Yeah, she wants to help, but she is also looking after her own self-interest more than anything. She's like, I'll help up until I can't be like discovered or anything. I'm not ready to commit to making enemies of the people I'm currently with.
Right.
So it's an interesting part of Claire's character. She's very calculating and like, I'll help Nona because I like her, but I'm not going to betray my own self-interests of aligning with the Emperor's sister. So
Yep.
that's where we're at. And it's an interesting line she manages to keep balancing.
hmm They end up meeting up with Kettle, who's by herself at this point and seemingly dead based on Clara's assessment, but they're basically Nona's able to help revive her. I'm kind of fuzzy on the details. Remembering this little interaction, but end up then getting Kettle back in the fold. And at this point, Zol has already departed, and she has rock moving powers, a la Yisht.
Right. She kind of disappears until I'll see you in the 11th hour, kind of a thing. So, which Mark Lawrence still plays off in an interesting way. I like how Zol kind of returns, but once she leaves, I'm like, I wonder what like blaze of glory she'll return in. It remains to be seen, but it does kind of keep her out of because she is like the most fresh in terms of fighting ability at this moment, and she kind of goes off and does her own thing, which you're not quite sure what it is, but you know that she's kind of out of the running in terms of getting Kettle and Nona to some sort of safety.
Right. And Kettle and Nona and sort of Clara, but Clara doesn't really want any part of it, go on to try to steal back the ship heart, so they're kind of occupied with that for a while, and we get a return to what's going on with Abyss Glass, where we get this reveal that it's actually Sherzal is the one who's on trial here, and I won't spoil anything from Game of Thrones, but it did make me think about a moment in the Game of Thrones show that we got in some of the later seasons where it turned out someone different was on trial than what we expected.
Yep, it's certain. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I can point the finger at who you're talking about, but we don't need to get into it. I will.
You could point the finger, huh?
But I will say that was Glass is not one to let herself get ensnared too much. I think she knew, like, oh, it's a topple of dominoes, because we know that she's still going in the direction that she's planning to go in, but she always has this thing of like, it could still go either way, and now more than ever, it's getting more and more dangerous. So we know Abyss Glass's ability to kind of see the cause and effect of certain things, but she's so far gone down in the ripple of cause and effect that she's not kind of sure what stage she set for herself. She's kind of playing with fire again here. I will go as far as to say that. And she does this like reverse, like does this like reverse card play of like, actually you're the one that's on trial, and because everyone's here now and there's no other way I could have united all these nobles and the Inquisition in one place without getting this far. And she's able to, they're weaving some moments of like, yeah, before I left my position as head of the Inquisition, I staged some falling outs with certain players to protect myself, to make it look like they're my enemies. And that all kind of comes meshed together here in this moment where Sherzal is on trial, and that leads to this whole chaos that ensues from putting her on trial. I think we're, unless I'm ready to skip to that moment.
Sure. So Sherzal reveals her secret plot when it looks like the stuff is moving against her, where she's like, I'm trying to get I stole the ship heart. I'm trying to get all the ship hearts because then I can control the moon and I can use it to the benefit of all of us rich people here. And
it's a compelling case, I'll say. I was like, she might win over the room with this.
And Abyss Glass was getting the sense of that too, Charles.
Yeah. Right.
So Abyss Glass has already taken a truth serum basically at this point. And then under the truth serum, she's like, yeah, well, your plan can make a lot of sense to people here, but it actually doesn't need you to be involved in it. She's
yeah, exactly. And she's also like, yeah, the Inquisition and the Church aren't the most effective forms of government. They probably won't get much done. And having been the head of both of those is pretty damning. So, but it's also kind of sparked this whole thing of like, why are you involved in this at all? Like, no, let's have no illusions here, which is more of that practicality that we get from a good Lawrence novel. and it's kind of, and then that's when Cherzal starts stabbing people or getting people stabbed.
Well, the shoot hits the fan to keep our clean rating here. When I mean, Aura ends up walking the path in all of this, which leads to a big sort of explosion thing.
Oh, you do have Jolie pulling threads, trying to manipulate the trial, and you have Darla pulling her chair out. You know, these like fun moments. The minute I saw Darla there, I will admit I was like, oh, Darla's the most prime to not make it of all these characters.
That made sense. Well, I do want to comment on the thread work battling because that was kind of interesting where Joelle is pulling the strings of one of the people deciding whether or not Cherzal should be questioned, and Aura's kind of like pulling the strings back, and he basically defaults back to where he was already leaning anyway. But yeah, the Darla thing.
Because Darla was able to physically just pull Jolie's chair out and break her concentration.
Yes.
You know, that was kind of what helped break this battle of thread working.
Yes.
Which is funny.
It is funny. Darla, it does feel like she was primed to not make it out of it. She got some of that like greater attention earlier in the novel where it's like, oh, it's interesting how Darla and Nona keep becoming so close even though she wasn't part of the OG crew here. Like, what's happening there? So Lawrence does a good job of setting things up where we'll actually care about Darla when she goes. It almost has a feel of maybe something where like Darla's dying here in the outline, if Lawrence even outlines. And then it's like, oh, well, guess I got to make sure they care about her by that point. And he did a good job.
I wasn't like predicting it, but I was like, I have bad feelings about Darla. Like if stuff goes down, she's the most prime, just plotting wise, to be the tool that goes. And so when she does go, I'm like, it all's coming into place here.
Yes.
I wonder if Abbas Class saw that in her domino effect. Doesn't seem like she did.
So, going back to Nona and the crew at that time, basically they had previously been like, we need a distraction. And that's when you get this sound coming from Aura walking the path. Eventually, they end up running into Yisht, who Clara notes she hasn't seen since Barrelgate. Like the barrel does get a reference. Like I haven't seen her since the whole thing with the barrel, and I don't really want to right now. And that's
yeah, it's funny when Nona when Nona was poisoned and put in the box. She's like, I'm in a box. I was like, did Yist do like a revenge barrel play? That would have been funny, but it was not the case. But yeah, we get back to the whole Yist thing, and this expanding of the lore and the setting with demons and the ship heart, which kind of reveals more, but also in turn adds to the mystery. It's a great way to kind of keep the suspense going of like, hey, ship hearts can deliver demons to a person. It's like, that's interesting how that's the case here with Yist. And
Yist is chock full of demons, Charles.
Chock full of demons.
And she gets into this fight with Nona. She basically says to Nona, like, you should have let me kill you the first time around because I wasn't cruel then. Now I'm cruel.
Yeah.
And it's so... I do love this thread that continues through these first couple books where the main antagonists, basically, even if they're not the big bads, the main antagonists, it feels like, are always just chock full of demons by the time we get around to them.
Yes.
It's like,
that's true.
So it harkens back to that, and we get to see the way their personalities change, where even if they were kind of bad to begin with, then they get worse when all these demons get a hold of them.
Chock full of demons.
Yep. It's an interesting battle that we get. Obviously, Yish can see it a little bit into the future, or at least can see what Nona and people, as Quixote says, primitive like her, are able to do. But she can't see what Quixote's going to do, apparently.
Mm.
It all ends up coming to a head where Yisht is threatening to kill Kettle. And Nona has already picked up on, like, hey, if I do nice things, then Quixote is in trouble. And if I do bad things, then Quixote gets more power. And Nona ends up in this place where she could actually run away, but it would leave Kettle to die. And she ends up trying to throw herself in the way of danger to try to save Kettle.
Right.
And that's when Quixote ends up transferring into Yisht, who, as we've learned, when you have those really vindictive, malicious intentions, that's when the demons get inside you.
Right.
So
And it's
Quixote
funny that
finds
up to
a
this
new
point,
home.
Quixote was like, you can't die. I have no one to transfer to. You know, he was like pretty indifferent. And then all of a sudden he has this self-preservation. And now he's like, no, like, I don't want this.
He doesn't want to share. That's what Nona says. It's like Quixote does not want a part of the debacle that's going on inside Yisht, and he ends up actually, against his will, transferring over to Yisht.
And Yish kind of is like seizing from having just one too many devils inside of her. And I will say, a quick tangent, for in the defense of the Noi gun, Nona does have Quixote vision, which goes, she would not have been able to survive without.
True.
So there is also that element of being a three blood or whatever they call it, and having demon vision that gets her through the one Noi gun that she manages to kill. So just a little piece there in defense of the Noi gun.
Well, Charles, we do have that in defense of Den episode that I was a little bit more of the lead on. You can be the lead if we ever do a in defense of the Noi Guin episode.
That's okay. I think I've said all my piece on that.
All right. So they end up in this situation where Clara basically reveals, now that Yisht is out of the way, Clara's like, oh, hey, I'm back. And she reveals that the Abbess and Ara and all these folks are in trouble. And as Nona's internal monologue notes, the ship part was just a thing, but downstairs her friends could be dying. And that's going to take priority for Nona every time. And they head off to try to help their friends. And Clara's still tagging along here, Charles.
She is still tagging along at this moment. She's very nervous. Like, she definitely feels a little exposed, but she is sticking with Nona up to this point.
She is. And they run into Thurin Taxis, and then Clara, I believe, ties a scarf around her head because she's like, I don't want anyone to see me doing any of this. It is funny just watching her navigate all of that. And we get this Clara that has been sorely missing throughout the book.
Yeah, she's still trying to skate around. She has yet to do this point of no return moment. She's trying to have her cake and eat it too, of playing both sides. And it's starting to get more and more reckless. She's starting to get more and more to this point of she can't have it both ways. But for now, she's going as far as wrapping covering her head completely in attempts to try and hold on to whatever, like, two sides play she has right now. So it's kind of funny to see her desperation come through a little bit.
Right. Because she's got it made to some extent when she's with the taxi, and she, she doesn't really want for much, but she knows that they're not good people. But Clara's a little more okay with, hey, I might be on the side with these folks who are bad people, but self-preservation and all that, as we've been saying, Charles, takes priority for Clara usually, at least so far. So we see then Nona do something, as the text says, a better person wouldn't do, to Thurin Taxis, where she basically just leaves him with the harm
She like
going on
super
him.
glues the harm to his body, which is really a hardcore thing to do. And she even, like, we alluded to this in the beginning of the episode, but when she loses coat,
Yeah,
she's now like
Quixote.
Quixote. I was like,
Not to be
not
confused
to
with
do
Coat from
King Killer,
King Killer.
right? Quixote, and
Same
she
letters.
kind of was like, man, I wish he was here, or I wish I could use him as an excuse right now. And then she feels
Yeah.
kind of ashamed as she's leaving the room, and even Kettle is like, you need to like process this and live with the decision, which I thought was very interesting for Kettle. Kettle wasn't trying to like push her in any way. I think Kettle realizes that as much as I was your teacher, you are now in this like level far beyond, and the best thing I can do for you is give you this experience of like, you need to make these choices. No, it's your choice and your consequences. And she does feel guilty from it. It kind of leaves the door open of, did Texas die, or does he live on to attempt to exact more revenge? We don't know. The doors are open, and then she misses the demon that was attached to her body, which is all kind of very interesting, telling, maybe even a bit troublesome.
Yeah, at least
But
a little
an
disconcerting.
interesting character moment we get at the like rising action of this book,
Right.
because that's a really evil thing to do, is to just to basically super glue this super horrible thing to someone's body, you know?
Yep. Well, we get lots of fighting, Charles. I know you always love those action sequences, and it ends up resulting in this situation where it looks like our Abyss Glass and crew are, I don't know, how are they going to make it out of this palace, which has gotten to the point where it's on fire, and it's a tough situation. They're kind of just coming to terms with it. Darla's slowly dying, and then to the rescue, it's Nona mostly. Kettle and
Yeah,
Clara
there was a
there
funny
too.
moment from Abyss Glass where she's like, they're all like pretty much resigned to defeat, and they're all circled around praying. And then Nona arrives, and she's like, I've seldom had a prayer answered so swiftly.
Yes. That is a great line.
Which was funny. So, yeah, Nona to the rescue. It was fun to have them in the same building without them realizing it. Kind of, you get the perspective changes, and you get to see where they are in time. It's like, oh, they're at like the exact same moment and place and time with this like explosion from from Ara walking the path and things like that. So it all comes to a head where they finally all are back together, trying to escape this castle where everyone is trying to hunt them down.
Right. And Nona does something that everyone's telling her she shouldn't do, which is walk the path again. She'd already done it earlier. And she is basically seeking to aid them in this escape. They're in like I guess it's a
carriage.
caravan.
It's a carriage, yeah.
Carriage is what.
But it's like a really fancy one.
Yeah. And she's busy trying to help power them through and move them through gates and things like that, and destroy things in their way and get arrows.
Because it's been led up to
coming.
this point that she can walk the path and like shoot out explosions, you know, so she can like create energy from walking the path. And we've seen her try and practice this in the first half of the novel, and now she's back. And this is also where the friendship theme comes to a head in this book as well, because there's like Yisht had called friends a weakness, and then we have Darla's moment in the like. I loved how the chapter ended with it's like, and the swords rose and fell, was like how they described Darla getting stabbed a bunch of times. I was like, that's kind of sad, but it was a great way to write off a character, is the implication that she was stabbed a whole bunch of times.
Right.
But then it's like, oh, we have her body and she's still breathing. I'm like, didn't swords rise and fall on her body a bunch of times? I guess she's like so big and they were able to pull her out somehow. But we got to have these like last words moments that felt very like 80s action, kind of like, what took you so long? Moments. And that pushed Nona to where she needed to go to walk the path.
Right. And she basically says she wouldn't have made it back if it weren't for Darla. And I think really well done to watch Lawrence take Darla from in around the middle of Red Sister, where she's just like a bully, to then by the end of Gray Sister, we're mourning her loss and buying in when Nona's like, Darla is the only reason I made it back. So another
Yep.
solid job
Yep. And then
from
he
Lawrence.
ties it, he compares it to that, what's the name of the medallion that causes all the pain again?
The harm.
The harm. Yeah. So she's like, the harm was a horrible
Yes.
pain, but it's like the pain of losing people that you love, losing your friends is another kind of pain altogether. And it's like she could walk away from, like, ignore that pain, but she's like, there's something dehumanizing about ignoring that, and it's the desire to come back and embrace that loss that brings her off the path. Not necessarily her love for Darla, but it would be disrespectful to her friendship to not feel that pain.
Huh.
And so to kind of like um that's what I got from it anyway, this idea of let's see here. But yeah, and then she goes on to talk more about friendship, but basically it's this idea of like, to ignore Darla's memory and feel that loss doesn't feel right. And it's that desire to kind of come back and process it that pulls her back off the path into reality, which was an interesting, again, exploration of friendship in this trilogy.
That Charles, that was so beautifully said and so poignant. Despite my training in psychology, I could not have spoken better about like
Wow.
the importance of processing grief. And I mean, that is such a good reading, I think, of what we get from Nona returning from the path here. I mean, sometimes you just gotta, it's normal to feel really, really crappy after you lose someone. And I think it's validating to us as readers who many of us have probably dealt with loss of friends or family or people we care about as well. So to remind us how valid that pain is, even in the face of this, like compared to this device that can cause you the most physical pain possible, and tell us kind of like, well, losing someone you care about, even if it doesn't physically hurt like that, is still worse in some ways. I don't know. I thought that was a really nice sentiment from Lawrence.
Right. So I think I found the moment here. Okay, so here we go. In the end, only Darla brought her back. Nona would have run the path forever. Something so right couldn't be denied. But for the fact of her friend's death diminishing behind her, something like that couldn't simply be thrown away, discarded, abandoned as if it held no worth or meaning. And with a howl, Nona turned in a place where there could be no turning and fell back into the world. So it's this idea of just like, to throw away her death as something so meaningless is what brings her back. So it's not so much her love for Darla as much as her kind of respect to her passing, which is an interesting distinction there.
Exactly, Charles. That facing the pain caused by Darla's passing is respectful to Darla and what she meant to
Right. And
Nona.
then there's that moment where they escaped, right? And they're like riding the carriage down the hill, and she brings up friendship again. It's like Yish had called friends a weakness, and then the pain that Hess's death and now Darla's had caused her was very different from that of the harm, but it was deeper and longer lasting.
Yes.
A weakness, though, it had been friendship that had Kettle follow her half the length of the Empire, friendship that had Clara spirit her out of the dungeons of the Noi Gun, and if she had to die, she would rather do it here under the scarlet heavens with her sisters of the red and the gray, free and fighting, than any alternative she could imagine. So that's where we end up with the whole friendship motif by the end of this book. That's like right at the end.
Those are great quotes that you pulled, Charles. And I feel like I've said this on Reddit before, too, under our account. It, Lawrence doesn't get enough credit for his prose. I don't hear people talk about Mark Lawrence's prose that much, but when you grab those snippets there, it's like, this is really well written. So
Right. I agree. And it has like this exciting element to it, this epicness of it, and the truth of it as well, too. This idea of like, how bad is friendship really? Like, It's what had united all of us and kept us strong and kept us grounded. And I'd rather be with my friends than all alone and free from being betrayed, which is a common theme in a lot of fantasy books, but it's done in a really interesting way here in Grey Sister.
Right, and we have the comparison point of Clara, who would rather be alone and not surrounded by her friends if that means staying alive, because she did not come along, Charles.
She did not.
Hung back.
Yep, very sad, because Nona's like, where's Clara? It's like, oh, she must have snuck away. The old
Shocker.
Irish goodbye from Clara. She just disappears. And I will say, only in a Mark Lawrence fantasy novel do we get only an author with a science background would give us a physics lesson on inertia right at the end on how she escaped. It's like, and then I angled this to that in this structure and push the energy off at this angle so that all of the force would be on this object, and we escaped. And I was like, it's like, whoa, we're getting a proper physics lesson here. I'm trying to picture it in my brain. It's like going back to my physics class in high school of like, okay, the angle of force. It's like, my hand's not as hard as the gate, so even if I were to punch it at full force, what good would that be if my hand would just explode? So you're like, yeah, wow, we're getting all this science here, and that's something that is a rare treasure that only a Mark Lawrence novel can deliver, I'd say. But they basically rocket ship the carriage out of the fortress and down the hill, and that's where we get to this end piece.
Right, Charles, and you were in AP Physics, if I remember correctly.
I sure was.
From our high school days. So if Charles is saying that, you can trust him, and you can probably also trust Mark Lawrence and his PhD.
Yes, you can trust my high school education. The one class I took in high school. It was college level, though. It was AP.
It was college level. And I did not quite make it into AP Physics with you, Charles.
I barely made it through, so it's okay.
All right.
Probably shouldn't have been
there. We were much happier in our, bio class that we were together with Derek?
Yes, our Regents level biology class.
That's
a much
where
happier
we
place. Yes. Exactly. So for the sake of time here, we reunite with Zol, I think is the good place to just get us to.
Yep. Zol emerges using those rock powers and stuff, where she now has the ship heart. So she actually got the other ship heart.
The Noigun one.
Yeah, there are two ship hearts there, and she actually grabbed the other one while everyone was thinking about the one from Sweet Mercy. So she basically causes a rock slide and they get away. And she drops that, I am the chosen one line, which was pretty epic.
Yeah, and we also get a development from Abbas Kalas's character, which was pretty interesting. So you should know the greatest joy to those who see the future is that life remains full of surprises. And you've all surprised me, which is kind of this cute little end to her arc in this book of I can be as manipulative as I want, but it's the joy in life's surprises that is what makes it all worth it. And this idea of all these friendships butting up, this cute moment that we get throughout this trilogy that we didn't get in a more hardened trilogy like Broken Empire. So it's oh, these are cute little moments wrapping up here at the end. And Kettle's choking up, a voice too thick with emotion to continue. So they're all kind of choking up and gathering around, hugging each other. But then Lawrence doesn't leave you without this little ominous piece of Nona catching just a glimpse of the demon in Zol from taking the ship heart.
Yeah, and someone at some point implies that the demons that come from the ship heart speak in your own voice, as opposed to Quixote speaks in his own Quixote voice, and this is switch back.
But we do know that only a demon can enter you if it if you have something in common with it, right? And then
I don't know if that's necessarily the case from the ship heart demons, or at least we don't necessarily know, because I just don't know if we know that that's the case with the ship heart demons yet.
Got it.
I'm not saying it's
I
wrong.
don't think we do, but it's demons do kind of work with what's going on in you already, and they kind of nurture that piece. But we don't know what's going on with Zol. All we get is that she sees the glimpse of the shadow, which we know from this book means that like demons exist as shadows on your skin, kind of, and they can travel around. They can't fully be unseen. They have to be seen somewhere on your body. And we see that only Nona's the one that sees the demon in Zol. And we know Nona's kind of sympathetic towards demons, so who knows where this is going.
She does miss Keo sometimes.
That's right.
Well, then the last thing we get is the epilogue. Lanotaxis is also a jerk.
Yeah.
Is one of my main takeaways.
Yes, I saw that in the notes. And then we have the ruler of the Noi gun, and then Clara. It's a fun moment where Clara's like trying to sneak her way up by standing alongside the other two, and Taxis is like, "What the hell?"
Well, Taxis, we're in his perspective, and it's, I don't know, funny is the right word, but it's interesting seeing the way that he thinks of Clara, where he just thinks of her as this upstart, but she has a role in all of this, so he basically
tolerates
has to keep himself
her,
from he tolerates her while keeping himself from hitting her. And it's always interesting when we get to see that, like, this is how a character we know well from a certain perspective is seen from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And
we get to see that with Abyss Class and Nona, which I liked.
Yeah.
Abyss Class saw Nona by the end of this book as like a leader, and also as someone who still like had crushes on boys and couldn't quite express it, so it's like interesting to see that perspective of Nona. And then same thing here with Clara.
Yeah, we get some of that with Regal, where Nona sees Regal again, and she's like, "Oh, what am I wearing?" Like,
right.
And it humanizes Nona and rounds her out in a way that I really enjoy. Well, and we also get the line,
"World is burning."
Yeah, the whole. Well, they're speculating on, is Nona or Sister or Cage going to run away, and basically the conclusion is, well, where would she go? The whole world is on fire, which is a great drop to tease us as we head into Holy Sister, Charles.
Yep, another great use of the setting by Mark Lawrence here to be like, what happened that would cause a place that was like freezing to all of a sudden be burning? And it's like, well, maybe they tried to mess with the magnifying glass and they didn't know what they were doing, and who knows? It's part of the mystery and the suspense, and I'm looking forward to. I have not read the third book, so I'm looking forward to reading it and getting the conclusion to this dynamic series that is the Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence.
Well, I have read the third book, but that is not stopping me from being excited as well, getting into the conclusion to this whole thing. Charles, how you feeling 2 books in? I'm
feeling good, man. I thought the second book really picked up and brought the heat right away, and I'm hoping, it also, as many things as it shed light on, it created even more mysteries, and I'm excited to see if any of this gets thoroughly explained in the third book. And I really enjoyed the ending of Broken Empire, so I feel pretty enthusiastic about Mark Lawrence's ability to bring it home in the last book here of the series.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Charles. Shall we call it here? You have anything else to say?
I could talk more of the nuances, but seeing as this is like our longest episode to date so far, I think we can just go ahead and play that outro music.
Let's play that outro music, and I'll make sure to remind all our listeners where they can reach us. You can find us at the FTF Podcast 1 on Twitter. Mark Lawrence sure has.
Heyo.
But you can also find us on Instagram or Facebook at the FTF Podcast. You can find us on our website, www.theftfpodcast.com. You can send us an email if you like that sort of thing at theftfpodcast@gmail.com.
So if they listened to this and thought, hey, a great listen, like certain best-selling authors, what can they do to show their support?
Oh, they can definitely toss 5 stars to our podcast if they're on Apple Podcasts, really. Other than that, I don't know, just tweet us or DM us and say you liked it, because that's awesome.
Follow us, subscribe, whatever
us.
it takes, That's right. Thank you all so much for listening, and as always, go forth and conquer, friends.